Accomplished Alchemist. Free and a green for a Elf Druid. It's a 2/5. It has add 1 mana of any color. We've seen these type of spells before, 4 mana dorks that are essentially mana dorks of any colors. But wait, there's more. It has also add Etz mana of any one color, where Etz is the amount of life you gain this turn. I think the card actually has some pretty silly shenanigans in Standard, if I'm being honest. Mostly because I know that there's cards like Erebos' Intervention in Standard and stuff. So let's say you're playing this like in Golgari Widowbloom, which Widowbloom is already having the life gain shenanigans, more or less. So what you do here is essentially you can play Erebos' Intervention on one of your opponent's creatures with how much mana you already have. Like let's say you have let's say you play this on turn 4, you play a land, you have 5 mana. So you can just 5 mana play Erebos' Intervention where Etz is 4, remove potentially a problematic creature, gain the 4 life, and then you can just tap this down and generate 4 mana of any one color, which then you could use to either cast like another spell, maybe even another Accomplished Alchemist, which by the way, these in multiples is going to be nuts, because especially if you can gain life, just being able to generate mana, just, there's some really silly shenanigans you can do with this card. The catch-22 is it is very high cost. 4 mana for this effect is a pretty high cost for a mana dork, so it's more of a combo mana dork, if you ask me, in my opinion. But it is one I'm going to keep my eye on, because it is one that could do some pretty silly shenanigans, especially if you have any life gain shenanigans within your deck design, so I'm going to give it an optimistic B+. I think this card's pretty good. Next up, one of my kind of like my favorite Quandrix cards that are at Rare, that's an NDFC. The Augmenter Pugilist, as well as, honestly, I like the Echoing Equation more, but let's talk about the front side first. Free mana, 1 and 2 green for a Troll Druid that's a free with Trample. So a free with Trample is pretty good. But as long as you control 8 or more lands, it gets 5/5/5. So this could be if you have 8 or more lands and 8/8 with Trample. Don't underrate that, especially with Embercleave in the format. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. That's a pretty good card. It's a pretty good aggro card. It's a pretty good stompy card. However, the one part I do like about this card is the Echoing Equation. 5 mana for sorcery. Choose target creature you control. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of it until end of turn. Except those creatures aren't legendary if the chosen creature is legendary. So, let's say you're playing like a lot of tokens and such. You play the Pugilist like a little bit earlier and such. Let's say you have like 2, maybe 3 tokens and you are up to the 8 land, so it's an 8/8. You play Echoing Equation on the Pugilist, and then essentially you make all your Pugilists into 8/8 tramples that don't have Summoning Sickness because they got transformed, which then can attack in for lethal. Yeah, this card is absurd. This card is good because I love the front. I do like the front side. Just being a free trample is decent. It does get removed by a lot of stuff in the format. But still, if you're going to just keep this out, that's pretty decent. But I love the Echoing Equation portion because there's so many. Like Ramza is saying here, imagine the possibilities. Like, let's say, for example, here's a silly shenanigan you can do. Like, for example, let's say you have the token-based shenanigans, your go-wide deck, and you have, say, like, let's say a veto on the battlefield. You then have, like, a way of, like, let's say when your creatures attack in, you can gain life. Oh, you have, like, 3 or 2 vetoes. You have, like, 3 vetoes on the battlefield thanks to Echoing Equation. You just essentially do any generation spell, like a life gain spell, and it does it 3 times thanks to 3 vetoes being on the battlefield. Like, there's just some really dumb shenanigans you could do with Echoing Equation. Exactly, and even Ramsa's pointing an example, like, let's say you have, like, Yarok on the battlefield, and then you have a few creatures, you then essentially Echoing Equation Yarok, cast any ETB, you do so many ETB triggers, it's not even funny. Yeah, Echoing Equation, I love this. Though, the catch-22 with this card, I will say, is that you do have to be in a semi-go wide deck or like a decent mid-range deck that's going to have a lot of creatures on the battlefield that will then, once you have the Echoing Equation cast, can become the copies of a powerful card. It's definitely a build-around card. It's definitely a Jank Brew card, but I really like this. I do like the fact that you also just get a decent stompy creature and a very great sorcery spell. So that's an A plus for me, in my opinion. That's an A plus card. Next up, Basic Conjuration. Free mana, 1 and 2 green for a sorcery lesson. It has look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You gain free life. Oh, yeah. Copy of Niv Mizzet Perron. Oh, dear. That's absurd. Okay. This one's weird because this is probably one of my least favorite lessons, but I'm not going to say it's bad. Here's the thing. The factor that you can tutor this out of your sideboard is nice, and the factor that you only have to spend free mana to look at the top 6 cards. Looking at the top 6 cards of your library is pretty deep, just keep that in mind. Looking at the top 6 cards, get any creature you want from it, and then put it into your hand. And then you put the rest on the bottom of your library on a random order. That's digging 6 cards deep into your deck. That's pretty decent. And then gaining free life to at least hopefully recuperate from the turn you're going to be casting the cast a spell. That's decent. You can do this from your sideboard, which is nice. I don't think this is a main board card. You are never mainboarding Basic Conjuration. You're only doing this if you're playing Learn. You're going to not mind having this as a card to tutor. I do think there are better rare lesson spells. This is probably my least favorite of the bunch. It's not bad. It's not bad enough that I will say, like, I'm going to give it like a C-. It's decent, but it's not amazing. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Next up, the Beogroth, which is a plant dog. Hey, another dog. Yay! It is a 5/4, but as an additional cost to cast a spell, you can sacrifice a creature or pay free mana. So this is either a 5 mana 5/4 plant dog, or a 2 mana you sacrifice your turn 1 token and get a 5/4. In Limited, I think this is going to be a really annoying card, because 2 mana 5/4s, that's pretty good. That's going to eat a lot of removal. And Ramza is going over there just looking at all the implications with Echoing Equation. Like, there's some jank you can do with that. But as for the Beogroth, this is pretty simple. You're playing Stompy. You have some aristocratic synergies within your deck design. You're probably going to play this card. 2 mana 5/4, that's a pretty good aggro stat on a 2-drop, potentially a potential 2-drop. So, yeah, that's a pretty good card for Limited. In Constructed, I mean, if you need a dog, here you go. I think a 5/4 dog is pretty good. So, if you're playing Dog Tribal, here you go. But this is like a D. This is a D card that I think will probably become a C- card or a C+ card if it's a good Pauper card. There's a lot of people that have been talking about this for Pauper, but I'm going to wait and see to see if it actually sees a lot of Pauper play. Next up, the big play. 1 and a green for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains reach until end of turn. And you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Never underrate these combat traits for Limited. These combat traits for Limited are pretty decent. Being able to give a creature temporary +2/+2 burst and a counter on it and give it reach. That's very good. It helps against flyers and such. This for Limited is going to be really good. Standard, I don't think so. I think there are just better combat tricks at that mana range, so this is more just a good Limited card. Maybe even a good Limited sideboard card. But still, I'm going to keep an eye on it. It's like a D-. Next up, probably my favorite Golgari Mythic of the set. Blitz the Vexing Pest. 2 and a green for a legendary creature pest. It has other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders you control get +1/+1. When Blitz the Vexing Pest dies, you gain 4 life. But there's more. There is also the backside, which is the Search for Blats. 2 and 2 black for a... Whoa, whoopsies. Well, that's what happens when you accidentally touch a keyboard. Physics, everybody. Anyway, Search for Blats, 2 and 2 black for a sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put any number of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. You lose free life for each card you put into your hand this way. This is probably one of my second favorite cards of the set, as well as my favorite Golgari Mythic of the set. Yes, we'll talk about the Elder Dragon, but I just like this card. A free mana free 2 that is a semi-lord for some very unpopular creature types. That's very nice. Also, just the factor is you do get also the ability on this. This is just a decent creature that has a really, really decent sorcery spell. Because one of the decks I kind of want to brew around when Strixhaven comes out is kind of like a Mardu reanimation list. And I do love Search for Bless just being a good card for Mardu reanimation. Because looking at the top 5 cards of your library, putting any of them into your graveyard, aka creatures that you're going to reanimate inevitably, which then after that, then you can just put the cards in your hand, aka removal or spells to reanimate, and just lose free life from it. That's pretty fine. Like, don't get too greedy. Don't try to draw all 5 cards. Or that's a bad idea. Because losing 15 life for this spell is not a good idea unless you're doing something to win the game. Let's just get that out of the way. At most, you're probably going to draw a card and mill the other 3, or draw 2 cards if you don't mind losing 6 life and such. But don't get too greedy is what I'm saying with this card. But best part is it has this great sorcery spell, which then has this pretty decent creature portion that you don't mind reanimating from your graveyard. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod. I can play this even in Mardu reanimation, not worry about having to have the green. And then just being able to get the little pest token that's also a nice lord for commander, especially if you're playing like pest tribal, or snake tribal, or spider tribal, or bat tribal, so... or even insect tribal. So, overall, this one, I love the card. I will say it will be interesting to see if it sees standard play. It's more like it's a B plus to an A minus kind of scenario. I like the card, but mostly I will admit I like it more for the Search for Bless sorcery portion, but I do love the creature portion of the spell as well. So keep an eye. I'm going to be probably playing with this card a little bit. That's up, Bookworm. I see what you did there. Heh, heh. I love my puns. Anyway, it's a 8 mana creature worm with trample, and when this enters the battlefield, you gain free life and draw a card. It also has an activated ability of 2 and green to put this creature from your graveyard onto your library third from top. Overall, this is probably the uncommon limited bomb of the set, because 8 mana to get a 7/7 that gets you life and draw a card with trample, that's absurd. And the fact is, if your opponent removes it, if they don't exile the spell, then you can be able to activate it to essentially put the creature back into your library third from top, and then be able to recast it later, and then still get the gain life ability and draw a card. That's really, really, really good for limited. For standard, I think it's too high cost, and if you are going with the 8 mana range, you would rather be casting like ultimatums and such. So I don't know about that. But overall, I do like the card for limited, so I'm going to give it like a C plus for limited. For constructed, it's more like a C minus. Next up, Charge Through. 1 green mana for target creature gains trample until end of turn and draw a card. I like this spell a lot. 1 mana cantrips, you never should underrate them, and the fact that this gives a very evasive ability, aka trample, so making like your biggest creature have trample, that's very, very nice. You get the cantrip ability of it, which is very, very nice, so it replaces itself. I like this card. I think it has a chance to see some play in some decks, so I'm going to give it like a B+. It's a pretty good card. Well, I'll see you in a minute, Ranza. Anyway, Containment Breach. 2 and a green for a sorcery lesson. It has destroy target artifact or enchantment. If its mana value was 2 or less, then you can create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token. Yet again, this is one of those fine kind of like lesson cards that I will not mind keeping in my sideboard that I can tutor out with a learn card essentially. Being able to essentially destroy like a problematic artifact or enchantment, like stuff like say Embercleave, the Great Hinge, maybe any saga that I think is problematic, or maybe Felidar Retreat. That's actually a very nice ability to tutor, so this is definitely going to be a decent card to tutor out of your sideboard with the learn mechanic. That's very nice. As for constructed, it has potential. I think there are better spells that do the same effect, but you do get the added benefit that if the mana value of the card is not of pretty much 3 or more, you do get the pest token, which I guess there are going to be some circumstances where you want to destroy like a Mazemind's Tome, so being able to destroy a Mazemind's Tome and then get a token out of it, or maybe even destroy like a equipment, destroy like any like a 2-cost equipment and then get a pest token out of it is actually pretty nice. So overall, I'm gonna give this like a I'll give it like a C plus. I think this card is decent, but it's mostly just for sideboard and mostly just because you're going to be tutoring it. Next up, Devouring Tendrils. 1 and a green for a sorcery spell. It has target creature control, deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. When that permanent you don't control dies this turn, you gain 2 life. I like this card for limited. I even think it has some implications for constructed. The catch-22 is Ramfru is still a card in standard at the moment. And Ramfru is instant speed, while this is sorcery speed. And the factor is it also has the additional ability that you can deal excess damage to your opponent if the creature had trample. So, I think this is more like really going to be a good limited removal card. That it has the potential for constructed post-rotation once Ramfru rotates and such. Because being able to get the effect that when the creature dies, you gain life, especially in the Golgari, which is having the life gain matter synergy mechanic very heavily emphasized, so something to keep in mind. I'm not going to say it doesn't have a chance to see standard play, but as long as Ramfru's in the meta, I highly doubt it. So I'm going to give this a C minus. But I will say, post-rotation, the grade might go a little higher. Next up, the Dragon Guard Elite. 1 and a green for a human druid 2/2, and has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And it also has an activated ability of 4 and 2 green to double the number of +1/+1 counter on Dragon Guard Elite. Overall, pretty good card. Just a 2-mana bear with upside that anytime you cast an instant sorcery spell, put a counter on it. That's pretty nice. As stated before, there are some ways that we could probably do some infinite Stormy-based shenanigans with Storm and stuff. Or at least get a lot of copies of instant sorcery spells in the meta. So being able to, let's say for example, you play this on turn 2, and then you play the free cost mentor spells I was talking about earlier in blue, which then copies itself because I believe Druid was also part of the creature archetypes that allows you to copy the spell again. So you have 2 spells on the stack, you put 2 counters on this, and then it attacks as a 4/4. That's pretty good. And also, if you can do Infinite Storm shenanigans and make this infinitely big, that can be game winning in some circumstances. But even if you don't go with the silly shenanigans, still this just being able to just buff itself every time you cast an instant sorcery spell to either protect it or just control the battlefield, that's pretty nice. So keep an eye on this card. It's a pretty decent dewdrop. Decent enough that I would give it a B. It's a pretty decent B, I would say. Next up, Ecological Appreciation. It's in 2 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library and graveyard for up to 4 creature cards with different names that each have mana value X or less, and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards, shuffle the chosen cards into your library, and put the rest onto the battlefield. Okay, so this is kind of like a balance to finale, more or less. So let's think of it like this. If you spend 4 mana on this, you're going to search up to 4 different creatures with converted mana cost 1. You probably don't want to do that, but that's kind of like the basis of this. So, at base, you can search up for 4 different 1-drops, and then your opponent has to choose 2 of those 1-drops to shuffle back in, and you get 2 free 1-drops. That's pretty cool for 4 mana. But I think you're not going to really want to do it for 4. I think you're going to want to do this for technically 5 or more. Because at 5 or more, then you have the options of 2 and 1-drops, which actually is a lot more better. I feel like the more that you can target creatures within your mana curve, the better this card gets to be able to tutor. So, like, I would say at bases, I would want Ets to be free here. So, 6 mana to essentially search up to 4 cards that have converted mana costs essentially free or less. That's pretty good, especially if you have, like, a combo deck of some sort. That's pretty good. Especially then your opponent has to be very decisive, especially if you have like a multiple combo deck or like once where you have multiple ways of activating the combo. So being able to just tutor for your 4 best cards for the deck, and then your opponent has to choose between a rock and a hard place. Now, this card gets more absurd the later you play it, obviously. Like, let's say if you can make Ed 6, so then you cast this for 9. Being able to tutor for like up to 4 6 or less cost creatures. Now keep in mind, one thing you have to keep in mind with this, no matter what, I think your opponent's going to be choosing the lower cost spells to essentially for you to have on the battlefield. Like, they're going to choose the highest cost creatures you choose as the 2. So, I would say if you're going to play this, you maybe want to do it where you are planning to tutor like 2 or pretty much 4 2/2s, 4 5/5s, 6 6s, etc., etc., etc. I still think it's a good card. It's definitely going to be a fun Commander card, I'm going to say. Because tutoring in Commander is a lot better, so to speak, and then you can make like deals with your opponents and such. That being said, for Standard, it has a chance. I'm going to say that. Especially since we have Ramp in the format, there's a lot of very high, powerful late game creatures, so I'm going to keep an eye on it. I'm going to keep an eye on it to the point that I'm going to say it's like a B-. It's a pretty good card. Pretty powerful card. Next up, Emergent Sequence. 1 in a green for sorcery. Search your library for a basic land card. Put it onto the battlefield tap. So it's Rampant Growth. Cool. Wait. And then that land becomes a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Okay, that's still land. Okay. Put a +1/+1 counter on it for each land you control that entered the battlefield that turn. So, if this was the only land we play... Well, actually, let's say you play this on turn 2, you put a land in, you play this, you do the ramp for turn 3, so then it gets pretty much 2 lands into the battlefield that turn, so essentially then that'll be a 2/2. So it'll be a 2/2 fractal token that can be stomped. This card is weird to analyze. Now, on one hand, I do think this is kind of a balanced take on Rampant Growth. Mostly because Rampant Growth is really good because turn 2 ramp is pretty good, especially of the Rand Lamp variety. The catch-22 with this one, though, is that it becomes a creature that the opponent can remove with a lot of removal in the format. This can die to Heartless Act, this can die to Stomp, this can die to an Eliminate, this can die to some of the most popular removal in the format. So, essentially, I guess the question I have to ask myself is, are there ways to protect this creature? Yes, technically, like you can play this like in this Selesnya ramp deck. You can play Selfless Savior on turn 1, then turn 2 do the ramp, and then protect your creature semi. But with that, then I would need to have an incentive to do that. Like, I have to have like a powerful play that I want to play on a turn 4 spell on turn 3, so to speak. Which I'm saying, I'm not going to say that option's not impossible, but it is something to be like cautious about, I'll say. So overall, I'm going to be a little pessimistic on Emergent Sequence and just give it like a D+. I'm not going to deny that 2-mana ramp is nothing to underestimate, but this is fair ramp. And most ramp, they want to try to be as unfair as they can, or try to not have their ramp be affected. This is ramp that can be affected. So, I will say though, if there is one catch in Pro Tentacon that makes it a little bit better, is if you're playing this in a ramp deck where you are having spells that you don't mind to essentially play multiple lands, essentially, you can, in theory, make a very big creature out of this, essentially. Like, for example, let's say on turn 6, you play like a Migrations Path, you tutor up for 2 basics, put them on the battlefield tap, and then you spend the rest of the mana to play Emergent Sequence, then you do the tapped land thing, and then essentially, and then it becomes a 4/4 creature, presuming you played a land on the turn with the Migrations Path. Because, yeah, the land you played, the 2 lands are 2/4, and then the 1 land you're 2/4, that's 4, it becomes a 4/4. That's not bad, I'll say. That can be potentially just good ramp or just become a 4/4. I'm still going to give this a D+. I think this is a card that's going to be kind of a trappy card, because a lot of people are going to be like, oh, this is Emergent Ultimatum, this is going to be awesome, and then it's going to get stopped, and they're going to feel really, really sad. Next up, Exponential Growth. I love my math puns. It's X green green. Until in a turn, double target creature's power X times. So, 4 mana to double creature's power once. That's not amazing, but not bad. 6 mana to double it 2 times. That's pretty good. And if you can get X to free, which in that case you would be spending 8 mana, doubling it 3 times is pretty silly, especially if you do it on a trample creature. So, keep an eye on this. I do like targeted spells, especially with stuff like Orvar in the format, so I'm going to keep an eye on this. I think it's more of just a fun gimmick card, but it's optimistic enough that I'm going to give it like a C-. I think there is some chance for this card, but I'm not 100% sure. Next up, Field Trip. 2 and green for sorcery. Search your library for a basic force card, put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle, and then you learn. This is probably one of the rare free costs, quote-unquote, learn spells that I don't mind being free mana, because this is semi-ramp. And if you're, like, for example, let's say you're trying to tutor for a 4 cost or maybe a 5 cost, like, essentially lesson, and then you still need the mana because you want to cast a 5 mana lesson maybe next turn, you can then do Field Trip, get the land you need tapped, and then tutor for the lesson, hope you don't get hand disruption, and then cast your spell. It's a pretty decent card. There's better ramp in the format, yes, but this one does allow you to semi-draw a card / tutor for a card, so you gotta keep it in mind. I'm gonna be optimistic enough and give it like a C+. I think it's a pretty decent card. Next up, Fortifying Draught. 1 green mana for an instant, you gain 2 life. Target creature gets +X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. So, if this is the only thing of life gain you got, it's going to get +2/+2. However, if you gain life through other means before combat, you could use this as a combat trick to, say, make your creature a... Let's say on average you gain like a life a turn. You can maybe make this 3/3, 4/4, 5/5. I think this is more going to be a decent combat trick in Limited, but I am going to keep my eye on this for Constructed, mostly just because it's a cheap instant targeted spell, it's a cheap way to gain life, it's a cheap combat trick, and we do have life gain synergies that are very powerful. So I'll keep an eye on it. It's more like a C- card, though. Next up, Gnarled Professor. 4 mana for a 5/4 Tree-Fort Druid with Trample. And when this enters the battlefield, you learn. This is probably the... If of all the high-cost spells that have the learn ability, this is probably the best of the bunch. Because here's the thing. With all the learn spells in general, they're just like semi-decent spells. This is just a really good creature. A 4 mana 5/4 with Trample, you will play that without even having the ETB trigger. And the fact that you do get the ETB trigger, which allows you to learn, which you can either use to rummage, or tutor for a card from your sideboard to help protect it, or help remove a problematic creature so it can swing in, that's very good. That's good enough that I am going to like give this like a B plus. It's a pretty good stompy creature. We do have already still good stompy creature in the format that's going to compete with, but if you want to tutor out from your sideboard and learn and still have a stompy creature, there you go. Next up, on a troll. I appreciate the pun. 2 and a green for a Troll Druid. It's a 2/free. It has Vigilance. If you would gain life, you gain that much life plus 1 instead. That's pretty cool. And it has, this gets +2/+1 as long as you have 25 or more life. That's pretty decent. 2 free with Vigilance for free mana. That's pretty decent in my opinion. So, pretty good card, I would say. Just by that stats alone for limited. In Constructed, I'm not going to underrate the factor that you gaining 1 extra life is not something to underestimate. Especially since we have the Cleric's Life Gain deck, or the Angel Cleric, that whenever a creature that's a Cleric enters the battlefield, you gain that much life. That could, in theory, get you quicker to the ability to buff up all your team. That's nothing to underrate. But on the other hand, that deck is not really wanting to go into Absan. Maybe if a Widowbloom life gain deck becomes a thing, they might try this card. I think it's more like a decent limited card, though. Overall, though, card's decent. And the factor is, if you're in the life gain deck, the factor that later down the line, it can become a 4/4 for 3 mana with Vigilance. That's pretty good. I'm going to give it like a C+. It's a pretty decent card. Next up, the Kerlock Wrangler. 4 in the green for an Elf Druid with Magecraft. It has, whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This one is more for limited, but there's definitely some silly janky shenanigans you can do with this in standard, so keep an eye on it. I don't really have much to say for it, other than maybe with Vorinclex it's kind of silly. Keep an eye on it. I'll give it like around a... I'll give it like a C-. It's a decent limited card that has some decent applications for Constructed. Next up, Kion, Dean of the Substance, as well as Ibram, Dean of Fury. So, Kion, Dean of Substance, 2 and a green for a legendary creature Elf Druid. It has tap, exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto your hand. And always put a study counter on it. Okay, so why do we want to put study counters on stuff? Well, it's because it has a mana sink ability of 4 and a green to create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each different mana value among non-land cards you own in exile with study counters on them. So, it kind of reminds me of that 2-cost Ixalan artifact that has this similar effect that concerns about mana costs within your exiled stuff. More or less with study counters on them. It's kind of interesting because it's also a semi-ramp tool, essentially. So, being able to, like, essentially tap this, if you have a land on top, you can ramp. That is very, very, very nice. Well, you put it into a hand, but you can play it. And then, essentially, you do have this ability to then essentially have mana sink later down the line to essentially make a fractal token. It's nice. It's not, like, amazing. Though I will say, Ibram, Dean of Fury is pretty silly for Commander. So, Dean of Fury has, it's a 4 mana free flyer bird wizard. It's flying, but it has Etz and 2 blue. Exile the top Etz cards of your library and put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own in exile with study counter on it into your hand. The main reason why this is pretty absurd is because in infinite mana combo decks, this is a way to win the game. Because what you do is you generate infinite mana, you activate the ability on Ibram to just essentially exile your entire library, return like your Fossis Oracle, or your Laboratory Maniac, or your Jace, and then you automatically play it if you have the infinite mana to play it, and then win the game. So that's the main primary reason why people are a little bit concerned about this card, but mostly it's for infinite mana combo decks. There seem to be a lot of decent cards for infinite mana combo decks in this set. Nevertheless, I do like this card because both sides are very complementary. A 4 mana free flyer that essentially will exile the top X cards and allows you to do semi-card draw. That's very nice. Which then also helps complement Kion, which is essentially when you have the mana sink ability, you can create a fractal creature token with pretty much that can range from being from the 2, the 3, 5, maybe even higher range. That's very nice. I'm gonna keep an eye on it, but this is like a equivalent C minus card. It's not bad, but it's gonna be really tricky to play this in constructed. I'm just gonna say that. Next up, Leyline Invocation. 5 and a green for sorcery. Create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, then put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of lands you control. Not bad, especially if you're in ramp. So this pretty much is saying 6 mana, create a 6/6 fractal token, essentially. And then if you're playing this like with more lands, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not bad. Keep in mind we have token removal. I think there's some better token generators in the set that we're going to be talking about in a quick minute. Overall, though, I'll give it like a solid, like, I'm going to give it like a C minus, or not D plus. It's a D plus card. Because it's more a curve filler for limited. I don't really see this in constructed. Next up, Mage Duel. 2 and a green for a sorcery spell. This costs 2 less to cast if you cast another instant sorcery spell this turn. Target creature control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. Then it fights a target creature you don't control. Each deals damage equal to its power to the other. Essentially, you know, your typical fight spells. So, essentially, what the spell is essentially it's a 3 mana fight spell that can become a 1 mana fight spell or prey upon, essentially, if you cast an instant sorcery spell. And it has the stat boost too, which is a nice plus. So, I think this is a pretty fine card. Yet again, I think there are better removal cards in the format that are kind of like fighting / dealing damage, that rapid bite, stuff like that, essentially. But this is a spell that can become decently cheap, and if you have like Magecraft shenanigans, then maybe you want to play this. So I'm going to give it like an average, like a C+. I think it's pretty decent, especially in the decks that want this effect. But I'm not like amazed by it. Next up, Master Symmetress. 4 mana for 4/4 Rhino Druid with Reach. And has whenever a creature you control with power equal to its toughness attacks, it gains trample until end of turn. So a 4 mana 4/4 with Reach and also trample due to its static effect, technically. Pretty good ability. And also being able to make your creatures have trample is very nice, like your Questing Beast, for example. That's pretty absurd. It's a pretty good card. I do think it does have a very slim chance, especially in Mono Green Stompy, to see play, because being able to make all your creatures be able to gain trample is nothing to underestimate, so keep an eye on this. This might see some play in Standard. Enough that I'll give it like a B-. Next up, Reckless Implementer. 2 and a green for a Elf Druid 2/2. It has an activated ability of 4 and a green to double Reckless Implementer's power and toughness until end of turn. This is more of a D- to maybe even an F. Don't get me wrong, a 2 mana Elf Druid, it's a bear with upside. Mana Sink for limited is going to be nice, but there's better mana sinks in the format. Being able to just only double this for 5 mana to make it a 4/2. Or make it a 4/4, and then essentially have to spend 10 mana to make it an 8/8. I mean, I think this is more going to be a decent sealed card. Let me put it like that. I don't think it's going to be a good limited card for draft. Unless you need the bear with upside, and even then there are better 2-drops. I could be wrong, but I think this is like a D- to like an F+. Next up, Scurried Colony. 1 and a green for a creature squirrel with Reach. This gets +2/+2 as long as you control 8 or more lands. A 2 mana 2/2 with Reach, perfectly fine, good against flyers. And then if you have 8 or more lands, making it a 2 mana 4/4 with Reach is pretty good, so good for limited. If you're playing Squirrel Tribal, you're probably going to play this in Squirrel Tribal for EDH, so that's a thing, so keep an eye on it. I'll give it like a C+. It's a pretty decent card. Okay, Spine Karok. 2 and a green for a creature crocodile. It's a 2/4. This is the equivalent of a D- to an F+. It's curve filler. It's for limited. I don't really see the scene playing constructed. Next up, Springmane Servant, I think is how you pronounce it. 2 and a green for a creature elk. Whenever this enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. So, if you have life gain synergies, keep this in mind. Nice curve filler. This one's more like a D plus to a C minus. More for limited. Not really much for constructed unless you're doing some flickering shenanigans. Next up, Tango Trap. 1 in a green for an instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature with flying or destroy target artifact. Pretty good. Pretty much tech card. More for the sideboard. You could probably mainboard at least one of these in limited at the very least. Not a bad card. It's more like an average C minus to a C card, though. It's a tech card most of the time. Next up, Verdant Mastery is our last green card. It's 5 in a green for sorcery, but you can spend 4 mana to pay this. What do? Well, you search a library to up to 4 basic land cards and reveal them. Put one of them into the battlefield tapped under an opponent's control, only if 3 in a green was paid. And then when you do that, you can put 2 of them onto the battlefield tapped under your control, and the rest into your hand. And then you shuffle your library. So essentially, this is like a super pumped cultivate. In a sense, with the catch-22 is if you want to catch it at the mana where it's migration path. So it's a migration path, which then you're giving your opponent a mana, essentially. But it's cultivate that you get a land in your hand, so you can play the land next turn. I think this card will see play. I think, yes, it's a migration path, technically, but I do think this is one of those spells where I think you'd not mind giving your opponent the extra mana unless you're against a mirror match of like Genesis Ultimatum or Emergent Ultimatum decks, where giving them that one extra mana might not be good idea, more or less, but I do feel like you don't mind casting this on 4, because then, essentially, if you cast this on turn 4, you get the 2 lands you need of basics, and you get the 1 land you can put in your hand to cast an ultimatum next turn if you need to, like your Emergent Ultimatum, your the Temur Ultimatum, Genesis Ultimatum. Wow, that was a brain fart. It's getting late where I'm at, so I'm grateful we're getting to the gold cards. Anyway, overall, I do think this card's pretty decent. Enough that I'm going to give it like a B minus, but be cautious. It also goes up to like an A minus when you're playing this in Commander, because land filtering in Commander is really nice, and you have the politics card with it, being able to give a land to your